The wind, a mournful coyote, howls across the sparse, unforgiving land, clawing at the flimsy door of Alara's isolated cabin. Inside, she presses a hand to her swollen belly, a silent promise to the life within. It's been months since she last saw another soul, months of solitude and a prayer for a safe delivery. Tonight, the prayer is different. Tonight, the storm outside mirrors a violence that just breached her sanctuary. A gunshot, then another cracked through the twilight too close. Now, a low groan comes from the crumpled figure she managed to drag from the snowdrift near the creek. A man bleeding unconscious, another casualty of this wild territory. He's heavy, and the effort strains her, but leaving him to the wolves or the freezing dark is unthinkable. Danger's close and a rescue might be at hand. Before we see if justice or peril finds them, share in the comments. What's your favorite story about someone being saved against the odds? And if you're rooting for them, hit like and subscribe. She doesn't know who he is or who shot him, only that his blood is staining her floor and his breath is a ragged, uncertain thing. The men who did this could still be out there. Every shadow thrown by the flickering lamplight seems to shift and threaten. He's a stranger, a danger, yet as she struggles to clean his wounds, a deeper instinct than fear guides her hands. He's also a life hanging by a thread, dragging him toward her hidden cabin. She has no idea she is saving not just a stranger, but a ghost from her own heart, a love she'd thought lost to the winds of time and tragedy. And with that unknowing act of mercy, his life and hers were irrevocably changed. The cabin was her only legacy, a small, two-room structure built by her father's hopeful hands years ago, before the fever took him and then her mother. Alara Mayhew had been alone since she was 16, save for the brief, disastrous marriage to a man who had promised security and delivered only heartache before riding off and leaving her pregnant and more isolated than ever. She had learned self-reliance the hard way, her days dictated by the needs of survival. Tending her small garden in the warmer months, trapping small game, chopping wood, and always listening for any sound that was out of place in the vast, silent wilderness that pressed in on all sides. Her pregnancy, now in its final, heavy months, had made everything harder, each chore a monumental effort, each twinge a reminder of her vulnerability. She had chosen this isolation, or rather, it had chosen her after her husband, Thomas, vanished. The nearest settlement, a dusty collection of buildings called Redemption, was a hard 2-day ride, and she had no reason to go there, no one to seek. The townsfolk, she knew, would have their own opinions about a lone pregnant woman. The man on her floor was a complication she couldn't afford, yet couldn't ignore. She'd found him face down near the frozen creek, his horse gone, a dark stain spreading on his buckskin jacket. The outlaws, for that's what they had to be, had evidently left him for dead. He was young or youngish, perhaps nearing 30, his face obscured by grime, a nasty gash above his temple, and a bullet wound high in his shoulder that looked angry and deep. His breathing was shallow. She'd used precious cloth to staunch the bleeding, her own worn dress torn into strips. He was lean but wiry, the kind of man shaped by hard riding and open skies. Even unconscious, there was an air of resilience about him, a stubborn set to his jaw that warred with his current helplessness. Jedediah Stone had been tracking the Kincaid gang for weeks. They'd robbed a stagecoach carrying Wells Fargo money, and as a newly sworn deputy marshal operating out of the territorial capital, it was his job to bring them to justice. He'd been close, so close, when they turned the tables, ambushing him in a narrow, snow-choked canyon. He remembered the sting of the bullet, the sickening impact as he fell from his horse, then a confusing kaleidoscope of pain, hoofbeats fading, and the encroaching, numbing cold. He'd been a lawman for 5 years, before that a wanderer, a cowboy, sometimes a scout. His childhood was a distant, sun-dappled memory, a small homestead nestled in a valley not unlike this one, a place he'd shared with his family and a girl. A girl with eyes the color of summer sky and a laugh like wind chimes. Alara. He hadn't thought of her name consciously in years, not with such clarity. It usually lived in the shadowed corners of his mind, a sweet ache he didn't dare disturb. He'd lost track of her family after a harsh winter and a sudden move. They'd vanished like smoke. Now, through waves of pain and fevered dreams, he felt a gentle touch, heard a soft hum. Was it an angel? Or just the delirium taking hold? He smelled wood smoke and herbs, a faint, clean scent that was achingly familiar. He tried to open his eyes, but the effort was too great. Darkness reclaimed him. But it was a less terrifying darkness now, punctuated by moments of warmth and a distant, soothing murmur. Alara worked through the night, her own exhaustion a dull ache behind her eyes. She cleaned the shoulder wound as best she could with boiled water and the last of her carbolic soap. The bullet had gone clean through, thankfully, but infection was her greatest fear. She found some willow bark she'd gathered for her own aches and pains and made a bitter tea, forcing a little between his cracked lips when he stirred and moaned. His fever was rising. The wind still battered the cabin, each gust sounding like the accusing voices of the men who had done this, perhaps wondering if their victim had truly perished. She wedged the heavy wooden bar across the door, her father's old rifle loaded and propped near her cot. She sat in the single rocking chair, watching the stranger, her hand protectively on her belly. The baby kicked, a small reassurance in the terrifying quiet. Who was this man? And what trouble had he brought to her doorstep? She glanced at his gun belt, which she'd removed and placed on the small table. A lawman's badge was pinned inside his vest. That explained the pursuit, perhaps, but it didn't lessen the danger. Outlaws didn't take kindly to lawmen, or anyone who helped them. A distant howl, perhaps a wolf, perhaps just the wind playing tricks, sent a shiver down her spine. The world outside was hostile, and now, a piece of that hostility lay helpless within her walls. Days blurred into a routine of survival and care. Alara tended to her patient, changing his dressings, coaxing sips of broth and willow bark tea past his lips. His fever raged for 2 days, and during his delirium, he muttered names she didn't recognize. Kincaid, Reno, something about a Wells Fargo strongbox. He also mumbled a name that snagged in her memory like a burr, a soft, almost reverent Ellie. It was a common enough diminutive, she told herself. Just a coincidence. But sometimes, when he was quiet, his brow furrowed in pain, she would study his face. There was something in the line of his jaw, the shape of his nose, that tickled a distant memory. A memory of a boy with laughing eyes and perpetually scraped knees. A boy named Jed. Jed Stone. Her childhood companion. Her first confidant. The boy who'd promised to build her a castle in the clouds. But that was a lifetime ago. That Jed would be a grown man now, if he was even still alive. This stranger was just a stranger. A dangerous one, perhaps. Slowly, the fever began to break. On the 3rd morning, she found him looking at her, his eyes, a startling clear blue, lucid for the first time. They were clouded with pain and confusion, but they were aware. Where? He rasped, his voice weak and hoarse. You're safe, Alara said, her voice surprisingly steady. You were shot. I found you by the creek. He tried to sit up, winced, and fell back against the bundled rags she'd used for a pillow. Who? I'm Alara, she offered, then hesitated. She hadn't used her married name in so long it felt foreign. Alara Mayhew. His eyes widened almost imperceptibly. He stared at her, a strange, unreadable expression dawning. Mayhew? He whispered, as if tasting the name. He searched her face, his gaze lingering on her hair, the color of ripe wheat, her eyes, the gray-green of a stormy sea. She felt a flush rise to her cheeks under his scrutiny. You need to rest. You lost a lot of blood. He nodded slowly, his gaze still fixed on her. Thank you, ma'am, he said, the formality sounding odd in the small, intimate space. For saving my life. Anyone would have done the same, she said, though she wasn't sure that was true. Many would have ridden on, not wanting to invite trouble. Not everyone, he corrected softly, his eyes closing briefly as a wave of pain or exhaustion washed over him. The reality of her situation settled heavily upon her. She had a wounded lawman in her cabin. The outlaws he'd been chasing were likely still in the area. And she was heavily pregnant, alone. She had made a choice, dragging him from the snow, and now she had to live with its consequences. She couldn't turn him out, not in his condition. But his presence was a beacon, potentially drawing the very danger she had spent her life avoiding. A sudden gust of wind slammed a loose shutter against the cabin wall, making them both jump. Fear, sharp and cold, pierced through Alara. Were they back? Was that the sound of horses? Jedediah, despite his weakness, tried to push himself up again, his hand instinctively going to his side where his gun belt would have been. What was that? Just the wind? Alara said, trying to keep her voice calm, though her heart hammered against her ribs. The storm isn't over yet. He looked towards the door, then back at her, his blue eyes filled with a new concern, not just for himself, but for her. It was a subtle shift, but she noticed it. The first flicker of something beyond a patient's gratitude, perhaps a protector's instinct, however weakened. They were two vulnerable people in a very dangerous situation, bound by her act of mercy and the threat that lay just outside their fragile shelter. The small cabin, once her solitary refuge, now held a shared peril and a shared, unspoken uncertainty about what the next day, or even the next hour, might bring. The days that followed were a tightrope walk of forced intimacy and guarded caution. Alara continued to tend Jedediah's wounds, her touch gentle but efficient. He was a good patient, stoic and uncomplaining, though she often saw the lines of pain etched around his eyes and mouth. He insisted on trying to help, despite her protests. Once he could sit up for more than a few minutes. He'd whittle at a piece of kindling with his good hand, making small, intricate shavings for the fire, his brow furrowed in concentration. "You don't have to do that," she'd said one afternoon, watching him. "Keeps my mind off things," he replied, not looking up. "And it feels good to do something, however small." Their conversations were sparse, practical. He asked about the area, how long she'd lived here. She told him about her father building the cabin, about the harshness of the winters and the fleeting beauty of the summers. She skirted around the topic of her husband, the father of her child, simply saying she was alone now. He didn't press. He, in turn, spoke little of himself. He confirmed he was a deputy marshal, that he'd been tracking the Kincaid gang. He didn't mention names from his past, or where he called home. There was a reticence about him, a deep-seated caution that mirrored her own. Yet, in the small confines of the cabin, barriers began to fray. She learned the rhythm of his breathing as he slept, the way he clenched his jaw when a spasm of pain shot through his shoulder. He learned the quiet way she moved, her surprising strength despite her advanced pregnancy, the soft lullabies she hummed to her unborn child when she thought he wasn't listening. One evening, as she ladled thin rabbit stew into 2 bowls, he watched her, a thoughtful expression on his face. "This cabin," he said slowly, "it feels familiar, like I've seen that ridge line before." He gestured with his chin towards the small window. Alara's heart gave a little jump. "Many places in these mountains look alike," she said, her voice carefully neutral. She kept her back to him, busying herself at the hearth. "Maybe," he conceded, but his gaze lingered on the window. He remembered a ridge like that, one he and Ellie Mayhew used to climb, pretending it was the rampart of their imaginary castle. He remembered the view from the top, stretching for miles. He shook his head slightly. It was the fever, the weakness, playing tricks on his memory. Elara Mayhew was a ghost from a past he could barely touch. This kind, resilient woman was simply Elara, his rescuer. She brought him his stew. Their fingers brushed as he took the bowl, a fleeting contact that sent an unexpected warmth through her. She pulled her hand back as if burned. "Thank you," he said, his blue eyes meeting hers. There was an intensity in his gaze that made her breath catch. "For everything. You need to eat," she murmured, turning away to her own meal. The small discoveries about each other came in fragments. She noticed a long, thin scar that ran diagonally across his left forearm, pale against his sun-darkened skin. It looked old. She had a vague recollection of Jedediah, the boy, falling from a tree and cutting his arm badly on a sharp branch. But many boys had scars. He, in turn, noticed the way she tilted her head when she was listening intently, a gesture so achingly familiar it made his chest ache. And the tune she hummed, a simple, slightly melancholy melody, was one his own mother used to sing. He'd taught it to Ellie one summer, and they'd hummed it together as they searched for wild berries. He saw her looking at his badge one day, which lay on the small table where she'd put his gun belt. "Does it bother you?" he asked quietly. "Me being a lawman?" She shook her head. "Law and trouble often ride the same horse out here," she said. "But a man's got to do what he thinks is right." "And what do you think is right?" She met his gaze. "Saving a life. Trying to make a safe place in a hard world." Her hand went to her belly. He nodded, understanding her unspoken meaning. He was beginning to see the steel beneath her quiet exterior, the fierce maternal instinct that had driven her to risk helping him. He found himself thinking less about the Kincaids and more about the woman who was slowly, painstakingly, bringing him back to strength. He felt a growing protectiveness towards her, a desire to shield her from the harshness that had already touched her life so profoundly. One afternoon, while Elara was outside gathering firewood, a task she insisted on doing herself, moving with a slow, careful grace, Jedediah, feeling a bit stronger, explored the small cabin more thoroughly. His gaze fell upon a small, crudely carved wooden bird sitting on the rough mantelpiece. It was worn smooth with age, its paint faded. He picked it up. His breath caught in his throat. He had carved a bird just like it, a clumsy, boyish effort, for Ellie Mayhew on her 10th birthday. He remembered her delight, how she'd treasured it. He turned it over and over in his hand. Could it be the same bird? After all these years, it seemed impossible, a wild, improbable coincidence. He was still holding it when Elara came back in, her arms full of pine branches. She saw the bird in his hand, and a shadow crossed her face. "My father carved that," she said, her voice a little too quick, a little too sharp. She took it from him and placed it back on the mantel, her back to him. Jedediah said nothing, but a seed of bewildered hope, or perhaps just bewildered confusion, began to sprout in his mind. The ridgeline, her name, the tune she hummed, and now this bird. Each one alone was explainable. Together they formed a pattern he couldn't ignore, yet dared not fully acknowledge. Elara felt his eyes on her, and her composure wavered. That bird. Jed had given it to her. She told people her father carved it because explaining the truth, that it was a gift from a boy whose family had moved away without a word, was too painful. Why had she lied to this stranger? Because the memories it stirred were too precious, too raw to share. And because the impossible thought that this man, this Jedediah Stone, could be her Jedediah Stone was too terrifying, too wonderful to contemplate. The silence in the cabin grew thick with unspoken thoughts, with the weight of shared but unacknowledged possibilities. The baby kicked hard, and Elara gasped, her hand flying to her side. Jedediah was instantly alert. "Are you all right?" "Just the baby," she said, forcing a smile. "Getting impatient, I suppose." He looked at her, at the swell of her belly, and a wave of emotion he couldn't name washed over him, tenderness, awe, and a fierce, primal urge to protect them both. Whoever this child's father was, he was a fool to have left her. He knew he should leave as soon as he was strong enough. His presence endangered her. The Kincaids were ruthless, but the thought of riding away from this cabin, from Alara Mayhew, filled him with a desolation that surprised him with its intensity. He was no longer just a recovering lawman. He was a man tethered to this place, to this woman, by invisible threads of gratitude, nascent affection, and a past that might, just might, be reaching out to reclaim him. The days shortened, the wind carrying a sharper bite. Jedediah's shoulder was healing, slowly but surely. He was able to do more now, chop small logs for the fire, haul water from the creek, even check the snares Alara had set. They worked in a comfortable, practiced silence most of the time, the shared tasks forming a rhythm to their isolated existence. He'd started calling her Alara, dropping the formal ma'am, and she, after some hesitation, called him Jedediah, though the name still felt too large, too formal for the quiet man who shared her hearth. Sometimes, just Jed would slip out, a softer, more familiar sound. Each time it did, he would look at her with that searching expression that made her heart flutter. One afternoon, he found her staring out the small, grimy window, her expression wistful. "What are you thinking about?" he asked gently. She started, then gave a small sigh. "Just remembering. My father used to say this valley was a little piece of heaven hidden from the world." "He was right," Jedediah said, his gaze following hers to the snow-dusted peaks in the distance. "It is beautiful," he paused, then added, "I knew a place like this once, a long time ago, with a girl, a friend. We used to explore all over." Alara's breath hitched. She kept her face turned away. "Childhood memories can be powerful things." "They can," he agreed. "Sometimes they're all you have of certain people." A log in the fireplace crackled and spat, breaking the charged silence. Alara turned back, forcing a calmness she didn't feel. "You should get some more rest, Jedediah. You're still not fully recovered." He nodded, but his eyes held hers for a moment longer, a question in their blue depths. He was remembering more clearly now the girl he called Ellie. Her quick wit, her adventurous spirit, the way her nose would wrinkle when she laughed. He saw flashes of that girl in the woman before him, in the determined set of her jaw as she faced hardship, in the unexpected softness in her eyes when she looked at the worn wooden bird on the mantel, in the gentle way she spoke to the child in her womb. The Kincaid gang hadn't been seen or heard from since the ambush. Jedediah hoped they'd moved on, thinking him dead. But a part of him, the lawman part, knew they were too dangerous to forget. He'd made discreet inquiries when he'd been strong enough to scout the perimeter of the valley, checking for tracks. He'd found old signs, days old, of two riders passing along the far ridge, heading west, away from them. It was a small relief, but not enough to banish the unease. His strength was returning, and with it, the pressing need to make a decision. He couldn't stay here indefinitely. It wasn't fair to Alara. He was a danger to her, a constant reminder of the violence that had brought him to her door. Yet the thought of leaving. One evening, the baby was particularly active, its movements visible beneath Alara's worn dress. A look of profound tenderness softened her features. Jedediah watched her, his own heart aching with a strange mix of joy and sorrow. This child, growing within her, was a symbol of life, of continuity, in a world that was often brutal and unforgiving. "He's strong," Jedediah observed quietly. Alara smiled, a genuine, unguarded smile that lit up her face. "Or she is. Likes to make their presence known." Have you thought of a name?" he asked, venturing into more personal territory than he usually dared. Her smile faded a little. "If it's a boy, Samuel, after my father. If it's a girl, I haven't quite decided." She looked at him then, a direct, searching look. "What about you, Jedediah? Do you have family? Anyone waiting for you?" The question hung in the air. He thought of his parents, long gone. His younger sister, married and living far to the east, whom he hadn't seen in years. And he thought of Ellie Mayhew, the girl who represented all the lost innocence and hope of his youth. "No one waiting," he said finally, his voice rough. "Not anymore." The admission created a new kind of intimacy between them, a shared understanding of loneliness, of paths diverged and connections broken. Later that night, Alara was awakened by a sharp pain, a tightening in her belly that was different from the usual kicks and flutters. She lay still, breathing through it, hoping it was a false alarm. But then it came again, stronger this time. Fear, cold and sharp, gripped her. It was too soon. Surely it was too soon. She didn't want to alarm Jedediah, but another contraction, more intense than the last, forced a small cry from her lips. Instantly he was awake. "Alara? What is it?" He was by her side in a moment, his face etched with concern in the dim moonlight filtering through the window. "The baby?" she gasped, clutching her belly. I think it's coming." Panic flickered in Jedediah's eyes, quickly replaced by a determined resolve. He had faced down outlaws, survived ambushes, tracked men across desolate landscapes. But this was uncharted territory. He was terrified, yet he knew he couldn't show it. Alara needed him to be calm, to be strong. "All right," he said, his voice remarkably steady. "All right, tell me what to do. I'll help you." He remembered his mother helping with the birthing of his sister's children, the hushed tones, the endless supply of hot water and clean linens. They had precious little of either here. He built up the fire, put a pot of water on to boil. He found the cleanest rags Alara had, remnants of old flour sacks she'd painstakingly washed and saved. He talked to her, his voice low and soothing. As the contractions came closer together, her pain more intense. He wiped her brow, held her hand, murmured words of encouragement. In those long, agonizing hours, as Alara fought the overwhelming waves of pain, all pretense, all guardedness, stripped away, she clung to Jedediah's hand as if he were her only anchor in a raging storm. And he, in turn, poured all his strength, all his will into supporting her, into willing her and the child to come through this safely. He saw her courage, her raw, fierce determination, and his admiration for her deepened into something akin to reverence. He found himself praying, something he hadn't done in years, praying to whatever power governed the universe to protect this woman and her child. During a brief respite between contractions, Alara looked up at him, her eyes wide with pain and exhaustion, but also with a dawning, incredulous realization. His face, illuminated by the firelight, his features sharpened by concern, suddenly clicked into place with a memory so vivid it stole her breath. A scar, not the one on his arm, but a tiny, almost invisible white line just at his hairline, above his left temple. He'd gotten it when he was 12, falling from the rafters of the half-built barn on his father's homestead, trying to retrieve a kite for her. He looked down at her, seeing not just the brave woman in labor, but the girl with summer sky eyes, the girl who had shared his childhood dreams. The way she said his name, the flicker of recognition in her pain-filled eyes, it was unmistakable. "Ellie?" he breathed, the name a prayer, a question, a miracle. "Ellie Mayhew." Tears streamed down Alara's face, mingling with the sweat of her exertion. I thought you were." She couldn't finish, another contraction seizing her, harder than any before. Jedediah held her tight, his own mind reeling. Ellie, is Ellie, here in this isolated cabin about to give birth to a child. The universe had a cruel and wondrous way of bringing people together. All the little things, the bird, the tune, the sense of familiarity, they all slammed into place. "I'm here, Ellie," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm here. I'm not leaving you." The revelation, the sheer unlikelihood of it, hung in the air, potent and overwhelming, even as the immediate, urgent crisis of childbirth consumed them. He was no longer just a stranger she had saved. He was Jed, her Jed, returned from the mists of time. And she was his Ellie, the girl he'd never forgotten. Now a woman of incredible strength, fighting to bring a new life into the world. The world outside, with its outlaws and its dangers, ceased to exist. There was only the small cabin, the roaring fire, and the two of them, bound by a shared past and a terrifying, miraculous present. He had been chasing phantoms of justice, while fate, it seemed, had been leading him on a far more personal, far more profound quest. He had found his way back to Alara Mayhew, not in a sun-dappled memory, but in the heart of a storm, at the very edge of life and death. The hours that followed were a crucible, forging their rediscovered connection in the fires of pain and effort. Jedediah, guided by Alara's gasped instructions and his own instincts, did everything he could. He held her, wiped her sweat-soaked brow, murmured encouragement. His voice a steady anchor in the storm of her labor. The knowledge of who he was, of who she was to him, lent a desperate urgency to his efforts, a fierce protectiveness that transcended mere gratitude or duty. This was Ellie, his Ellie, and he would not let her falter. He remembered snippets of lore from his own mother, from ranch hands talking about births. He kept the water hot, the rags clean. He massaged her back when the pains were at their worst, his touch surprisingly gentle for a man whose hands were more accustomed to reins and rifles. Alara, drawing strength from his presence, from the unbelievable reality of his being there, fought with a courage that astounded him. There were moments she thought she couldn't go on, when the pain threatened to overwhelm her. But then she would look into Jedediah's earnest, anxious eyes, feel the steadfast grip of his hand, and find a new reserve of strength. He was Jed, her childhood friend, the boy who had promised her impossible things, now here, sharing the most terrifying and sacred moment of her life. Just as the pale light of dawn began to seep through the cracks in the shutters, with one final, tearing cry from Alara, the baby came into the world. A small, slippery, perfect being, letting out a surprisingly lusty wail. "A girl," Jedediah breathed, his voice choked with emotion as he carefully, awkwardly, took the infant from Alara and wrapped her in the cleanest piece of flannel they had. He looked down at the tiny, red-faced creature, her eyes squeezed shut, her fists waving feebly, and an overwhelming wave of tenderness washed over him. Alara lay back, utterly spent but radiant, tears of exhaustion and joy tracking through the grime on her face. Is she all right?" "She's beautiful, Ellie," Jedediah said, his own eyes suspiciously bright as he gently laid the swaddled baby on Alara's chest. "She's perfect." Alara gazed down at her daughter, and then up at Jedediah. Their eyes met over the small, precious bundle, and in that look, years of separation, of unspoken longing, of hardship and loss, seemed to melt away. They were no longer just Jed and Ellie, the children who had played by the creek, nor were they just a wounded lawman and the solitary woman who had saved him. They were something new, something forged in shared peril and miraculous reunion, now bound together by the new life nestled between them. The cabin was quiet now, save for the soft crackling of the fire and the occasional snuffing sound from the newborn. The storm outside had passed, leaving behind a world washed clean, blanketed in fresh snow. As Alara drifted into an exhausted sleep, the baby cradled in her arms, Jedediah sat watching them, his heart too full for words. He gently cleaned the worst of the birthing mess, his movements slow and deliberate, his mind still trying to process the enormity of what had happened. Ellie, and now her daughter. His life had taken a turn so sharp, so unexpected. He felt as if he were walking in a dream. But the reality of their situation soon began to assert itself. The Kincaid gang. They were still out there. He had responsibilities, a duty. But looking at Alara and her child, A new, far more powerful duty settled upon him. He had to protect them, whatever it took. He checked his colt, the familiar weight a grim comfort. He barred the door more securely this time. He peered out the small window. The valley was serene, deceptively peaceful under its white mantle. But he knew that peace could be shattered in an instant. The Kincaids were not men to give up easily, especially if they suspected he was still alive and knew who had sheltered him. Later that day, when Alara awoke, weak but clear-eyed, she found Jedediah mending a tear in his buckskin jacket, his brow furrowed in concentration. The baby slept soundly in a makeshift cradle he'd fashioned from a sturdy wooden box, lined with soft rags. "Jed," she said softly. He looked up, his expression tender. "You should rest, Ellie." "I can't believe it's you," she whispered, shaking her head slowly. "After all this time. I heard your family moved south after the bad winter. I never knew where." "We did," he said. "My father thought there'd be better land. It was hard, leaving. Hardest part was leaving you." The admission hung in the air, simple and profound. "I missed you," she confessed, her voice small. "I missed our adventures." A faint smile touched his lips. "Me too. I never found another partner in crime quite like you." Ellie Mayhew, his smile faded. "What happened to you after we left? And the baby's father?" Alara's gaze dropped. She told him then, haltingly, about her parents' passing, about her brief, unhappy marriage to Thomas, a smooth-talking gambler who had promised her the world and then disappeared when he found out she was pregnant, leaving her with nothing but debts and this isolated cabin. Jedediah listened, his jaw tightening, his eyes growing dark with a cold anger towards the man who had abandoned her. He reached out, tentatively, and covered her hand with his. "You've been through so much. Alone." "Not entirely alone now," she said, her eyes meeting his, a fragile hope dawning in their depths. But the fragile peace of their reunion was not destined to last. 2 days later, as Jedediah was splitting firewood just outside the cabin, keeping a wary eye on the tree line, he heard it, the distinct sound of horses, several of them, approaching from the direction of the pass. Not the casual pace of travelers, but the purposeful tread of men who knew where they were going. His heart sank. The Kincaids. He moved quickly, silently. "Ellie!" he called urgently, ducking back inside. "Trouble. Get the baby. Stay away from the window." Fear, sharp and immediate, leaped into Alara's eyes, but she didn't panic. She scooped up her sleeping daughter, her movements swift despite her recent ordeal. She'd faced hardship all her life. This was just another, more dangerous, form of it. Jedediah grabbed his rifle, checked its load. His shoulder still twinged, but adrenaline masked the pain. He peered through a tiny crack in the shutter. For riders, sunlight glinting off their rifle barrels. He recognized the brutal, heavy-set figure of Frank Kincaid in the lead. "They must have doubled back or heard something in redemption," he muttered, more to himself than to Alara. "What do we do?" Alara whispered, her voice tight with fear, clutching her baby protectively. Jedediah looked at her, at the tiny, innocent child. There was no question of surrender. Kincaid wouldn't leave witnesses, especially not a lawman and anyone who'd aided him. "We fight," he said, his voice grim. "You know how to use that rifle your father left?" She nodded. "He taught me to protect myself." "Good. Stay low. If they breach the door, aim for the biggest 1 inch." He gave her a hard, quick look. "Ellie, I know, Jed," she said, her eyes meeting his, full of fear but also a fierce resolve. "We'll face them together." He touched her cheek, a fleeting caress. "I never thought I'd find you again. I won't lose you now." The riders were close now, their voices audible. "Halloo, the cabin." Frank Kincaid's rough voice boomed. "We know you're in there, Marshal. And the woman who's been hiding you." Jedediah moved to the door, rifle ready. "Kincaid," he shouted back. "This is between you and me. Leave the woman and child out of it." A harsh laugh answered him. "Not likely, Marshal. You should have picked your friends more carefully. Send out the woman, and we might let the brat live." Rage, cold and pure, surged through Jedediah. He glanced back at Alara. Her face was pale, but her eyes blazed. She had positioned herself near the small rear window, her father's rifle steady in her hands. "There's no bargaining with him, Jed," she said quietly. He knew she was right. He took a deep breath. "Ellie, whatever happens, I love you, Jedediah Stone," she whispered, the words a fierce, desperate confession. "I always have." His heart clenched. "I love you too, Ellie." There was no more time for words. "Come on out, Marshal," Kincaid yelled. "Or we burn you out." "Try it," Jedediah roared back. The first shot splintered the wood of the door near his head. The fight had begun. The air in the small cabin exploded with the deafening roar of gunfire. Wood splintered from the door and window frames as the outlaws outside unleashed a volley. Jedediah returned fire, aiming carefully, making each shot count. He was one man, not fully healed, against four, but he was fighting for more than just his own life now. He was fighting for Ellie, for their daughter, for the impossible second chance they'd been given. "Stay down, Ellie," he yelled over the din, as a bullet thudded into the log wall perilously close to where she crouched with the baby. The infant, startled by the noise, began to wail, a thin, terrified sound that tore at Jedediah's heart. Alara, her face pale but resolute, held her baby tighter for a moment, then carefully placed her in the makeshift cradle, pushing it further under the sturdy table. She picked up her father's rifle. Her hands were shaking, but her resolve was firm. This was her home, her child, her Jed. She would not let these men destroy it all. "I've got the back window, Jed," she called out, her voice surprisingly steady. Jedediah risked a glance. He saw one of the outlaws trying to circle around to the rear of the cabin. "Watch yourself, Ellie." He fired again, saw one of Kincaid's men stumble and fall, clutching his leg. "One down." Frank Kincaid, enraged, bellowed orders. "Spread out. Rush the door on my signal." Jedediah knew they couldn't withstand a direct assault on the flimsy door. He had to break their nerve, disrupt their attack. He waited, listening intently, trying to predict their next move. He heard a scraping sound near the front window. One of them was trying to pry the shutter open. He fired through the shutter, heard a yelp of pain. "Jed, one of them is at the back," Alara cried out. A shot came through the rear window, missing her by inches. She didn't flinch. She took careful aim with her father's rifle and fired. A strangled cry, and then silence from that direction. Jedediah felt a surge of pride. His Ellie. She was magnificent. But Frank Kincaid was a different breed, cunning and ruthless. "They got Charlie," he roared. "Burn him out. Get the damn torch." Jedediah's blood ran cold. Fire was their greatest fear in this dry, wooden cabin. He saw a flicker of orange through a crack in the door. One of the remaining outlaws was trying to light a torch. "Ellie, they're trying to set fire to the cabin." There was no time for finesse. Jedediah kicked open the door, firing his Colt repeater as he stepped partway out. A sudden, unexpected target. He shot the man with the torch, who dropped it sputtering into the snow. That left only Frank Kincaid. Kincaid, caught by surprise at Jedediah's bold move, raised his own rifle. Both men fired almost simultaneously. Jedediah felt a searing pain in his already wounded left shoulder as Kincaid's bullet struck him again, spinning him around. He stumbled, his vision blurring, but he stayed on his feet, thumbing back the hammer of his Colt. Kincaid advanced, a cruel sneer on his face. "Looks like your luck's run out, Marshal." Through a haze of pain, Jedediah raised his pistol. He saw Ilara in the doorway behind Kincaid, her rifle aimed, but Kincaid was between them. It was up to him. He focused all his remaining strength, all his will into that one last shot. He fired. Kincaid staggered, a look of shocked disbelief on his face. He clutched his chest, then slowly crumpled to the ground. Silence descended, vast and ringing, broken only by the baby's frightened cries and Jedediah's harsh, ragged breathing. He leaned against the doorframe, his left arm useless, blood dripping onto the snow. Ilara rushed to his side, her face a mask of terror and relief. "Jed! Oh, Jed!" She helped him back inside, easing him down onto the floor. The baby continued to wail. "The baby!" Jedediah gasped, his gaze going to the cradle. She's fine," Ilara assured him, her hands already working to assess his new wound. It was bleeding badly. "We need to stop this bleeding." Her hands, though trembling, were swift and sure as she tore strips from her own petticoat to make a pressure bandage. The cabin was a wreck, bullet holes pocking the walls, the acrid smell of gunpowder heavy in the air. Outside, for men lay dead or dying in the snow. But inside, life, however fragile, endured. As Ilara worked, Jedediah looked at her, his vision swimming. "Ellie," he whispered, "you saved us." She shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "We saved each other, Jed. Just like we always did." He managed a weak smile. He felt himself slipping, the darkness encroaching. But this time, it wasn't a terrifying void. It was a darkness filled with the image of Ilara's face, her strength, her love. He had found her. They had survived. That was all that mattered. When he next opened his eyes, the weak afternoon sun was filtering through the bullet-scarred shutters. Ilara was sitting beside him, her hand on his forehead, the baby asleep in the crook of her other arm. Her face was smudged with soot and exhaustion, but to him, she had never looked more beautiful. "Hey!" he rasped. A relieved smile transformed her face. "Hey yourself, lawman. You gave me quite a scare." "Shoulder hurts like hell," he admitted. "The bullet went through again. Clean like the last one." "You're tough, Jedediah Stone," she paused. "A posse from Redemption rode in about an hour ago. Someone must have heard the shooting. They took care of things outside." He nodded, relieved. "Kincaid. Dead," she confirmed quietly. "It's over, Jed. They're gone." It was over. The outlaws were dealt with. The immediate threat was neutralized. He looked at Ilara, at the tiny, peaceful face of their daughter. He thought with a jolt of profound realization. He wasn't the baby's biological father, but in that moment, a bond deeper than blood was forged. This child, born of Ellie, born into such peril, was his to protect, to cherish. "What will you name her?" he asked softly. Ilara looked down at the sleeping infant, then back at Jedediah, her eyes shining. "I was thinking, Hope, because that's what you brought back to me, Jed." "Hope. It was a good name. Perfect name." He reached out his good hand, and she took it, her fingers lacing with his. The small cabin, battered but still standing, felt like a sanctuary, a hard-won haven. The ghosts of their past had finally led them not to sorrow, but to a new, shared future. He saw it reflected in Ilara's eyes, in the fierce, tender way she held their daughter. He had been lost for so long, chasing shadows, running from his own heart. But in saving him, in ways she couldn't have imagined when she first dragged him from the snow, Ilara Mayhew, the girl of his boyhood dreams, the woman of his heart, had guided him home. The landscape outside was still wild, the future uncertain, but within the walls of this small cabin, surrounded by the love of this extraordinary woman and the promise of a new life, Jedediah Stone knew, with absolute certainty, that he was exactly where he was meant to be. The sun sets, painting the snow-capped peaks in hues of rose and lavender. Inside the small, repaired cabin, A quiet warmth emanates from the hearth. Alara hums softly as she rocks Little Hope, her expression serene. Jedediah, his arms still in a sling but his eyes clear and full of a peaceful light, watches them. He's mending a small wooden toy, a clumsy replacement for the bird that still sits on the mantel, a silent testament to their long-interrupted story. The harshness of the land remains, the memory of the outlaws a fading scar. But within these walls, a resilient love has taken root, nurtured by courage and a bond that time and trial could not break. He has found more than just shelter. He has found his heart, his family, his home. Thanks for watching. If you believe in compassion, overcoming prejudice, and finding love in unexpected places, give this story a like and subscribe for more. This story showed love and heroism where least expected. What was your favorite moment of connection between them? Tell us in the comments.